Hello, I'm Paul Peterson. Despite efforts by public and private institutions and organizations over the past several years, elders still struggle to make basic ends meet in the United States. 10% of those aged 65 or older live in poverty. Today we will hear about the California Elder Economic Security Standard, a measure of well-being that determines the income and supports needed for older adults to live modestly, depending on their health and life circumstances. Stay tuned for Aging in LA. The California Elder Standard demonstrates exactly how much it costs to age in place in each county in the state. It includes the cost of housing, out-of-pocket health care expenses, transportation, and other basic needs. It is calibrated to household size, health status, and life circumstances. Unlike the federal poverty line, which describes poverty in this country, the Elder Standard measures what it takes to maintain a basic level of economic self-sufficiency. The Insight Center for Community Economic Development and the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research calculated the standard in part to reduce poverty and promote the health and wellness of older adults. Our guests, first from the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, its director, Susan Smith, and Dr. Stephen Wallace, who is with the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. Thank you both for coming. Now, some people say numbers are too dry and all the rest, but there are real people involved in the importance of these numbers. So, Susan, let me start with you. How do you see the picture as it's developed through these statistics on what it takes for a senior to live modestly?
Well, what we see is there is a big gap between what elders have in terms of their income and what it really takes to make ends meet here in California, and especially here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, especially here in Los Angeles and San Francisco, of course. But Dr. Wallace, these numbers are almost chilling. We've had a chance to look at slides, and I want our viewers to understand that this is you. This is who you are if you're a senior in Los Angeles. Was there a significant surprise as you developed these numbers?
I think what was maybe the most shocking was the gap between what the federal government says an older person needs to live on and what older people actually need to live on. What's important about the Elder Standard is that it's a measure of what people actually have to spend. It's not some imaginary number that was made like the poverty line 40 years ago. And so what we did is we looked at what it actually costs an older person in Los Angeles City, Los Angeles County, each of the counties in California, to be able to pay for their basic costs of living.
Right. Well, in these days of inflation and escalating housing costs and all the rest, these can be very slippery numbers. The joke around here is, $4 gas and $5 milk. Just basic nutrition costs, they're going through the roof all of a sudden, and that can really impinge on a senior who may be unable to cover medical costs for prescription drugs. Do you see that as well, Susan?
Yes, we do see that. I mean, elders, they're living on fixed incomes, and the prices keep going up. And so we have this dilemma where, just because rent goes up or gas goes through the roof, my income doesn't go up.
Right.
And so we have this problem where Social Security is now, when it was originally developed, it was only supposed to assume that people only lived another 9 years. Now we see on average elders are living 18 additional years.
Right.
And so that limited income is supposed to stretch more and more, and yet prices continue to rise.
Right. Well, the good news, though, is that thoughtful people who can sit down either with family and friends can you've provided a roadmap with these statistics. This isn't specific to the individual, but this gives you a general sense of what it costs. Stephen, can you run me through a little bit of how you assembled these numbers and how it's so specific to Los Angeles?
Sure, of course. So if we look at the different components of the elder standard.
Okay, here we are. We're all seeing them on the screen together.
Great. So what we did is we started with the cost of housing, which is actually the largest component of the cost of living for most older adults in Los Angeles and in the rest of the country.
Wow, that disparity between having the mortgage and not having it is really stark.
And so what we did is we looked at realizing that older adults are in different living situations, looked at how much it costs for an older adult to rent a one-bedroom apartment. This is from the federal government. They do a survey every year, so these are real costs. To rent a one-bedroom apartment in the city of Los Angeles, they figure at the 40th percentile. So this is less than the average cost.
Right.
It's a little over $1,000 a month.
Try to find a one-bedroom for $1,000 a month.
Exactly. If you are still paying on your mortgage, we once again looked at federal statistics, so this is real data, it's not imaginary data, and the average older adult in Los Angeles City who's still paying a mortgage is paying almost $1,900 a month for their mortgage, utilities,
Sure.
insurance, and taxes. The only group that you can say has a decent cost of housing is those older adults who've actually already paid off their mortgage.
Right.
And I guess this surprised me a little bit. So if you're paying no mortgage, you're still paying close to $500 a month. That's,
Right.
once again, that's taxes, utilities,
Utilities.
insurance. Sort of the basic cost of just maintaining your home is still
Right.
$500 a month.
And of course, those bills are really subject to tinkering with our politicians. Now let's go to the
Yes.
next slide.
So
Food.
after housing, an important component is the cost of food. Once again, this is a modest diet for an older adult, or we also looked at an older couple.
Right. Two can live more cheaply than one here with
And
the
this-
elder couple.
Yes, this does not include going out. This is only meals
Right.
eaten at home. So the elder standard is a very basic cost of living. We looked at transportation, which is based on the cost of driving. Once again, local driving. This doesn't include going to your grandchild's christening
yeah,
or a
something.
wedding
Yes.
or anything else. This is simply local transportation. And then the cost of health care. Now, actually in Los Angeles, we're somewhat fortunate because Medicare Advantage for the HMO plans is quite reasonable.
Wow.
In some rural counties where they don't have Medicare Advantage, you end up paying a lot of extra money for prescription drug policy, Medicare
Right.
supplement policy, and this is for people in good health. So if you end up in the hospital, if you end up disabled, your out-of-pocket costs end up a lot more. So
Right.
this is what a person can look at in good health.
And under miscellaneous?
And then miscellaneous are other costs that aren't included in the other places. Your telephone, your
going to the movies, something
buying
like that.
a new shirt now and then, some new
Right.
shoes when they wear out. So
Yeah.
it's the basic costs.
Well, there's some comfort in those numbers, at least regarding Los Angeles. Now, you've created an index, though, so we can actually see how these numbers coalesce.
So these all add up.
Yes.
For an elder person who's renting, it's just under $2,000 a month. For a couple, it's about $2,500. So the reason the couple actually is not a whole lot more than the single person is we assume that a single person is going to have to rent a one-bedroom apartment. A couple can live in that same one-bedroom apartment. So they're
Exactly.
sharing housing costs.
Yes, yes.
And once again, it shows the difference. If you're paying a mortgage, it's a lot more. If your mortgage is paid off, it's a bit less.
And then comes the truly significant thing, the totals. Because
Annually-
look at those numbers.
Annually, it's about almost $23,000 a year for a person who's renting, a single person. And if you're paying on a mortgage, it's over $33,000 a year, which is not an inconsequential amount of money. For a
Not
basic,
at all.
just to emphasize, this is a basic cost of living.
This is a modest lifestyle. Well,
Exactly.
you've done yeoman's work because we need to have these numbers. People need to plan. I'm thinking of all of the trade unions that need to look to their members' futures. I'm thinking about our retirement plans for the city employees, state employees. This is really good news. Now, I see on your lap that you have a pamphlet that you brought with us. You're going to need a pencil and paper. Well, I always do this on every show because you can access this online. Is that correct?
Yes. So this is a report that we published recently. It shows that the federal poverty line, which is what the government uses to say what an older adult needs to live on, actually grossly underestimates what the actual costs are of living for an older adult in Los Angeles and in every county in California.
I see. And Susan, you have one as well, which I'd like you to hold up there
do.
for people to see. Elders living on the edge. That describes pretty much the economic realities facing seniors.
That's right. And what this goes through is what are some of those supports that elders who are living on the edge can access? And where do those different supports fall short? What can we do about that as a community of seniors, as advocates, as policymakers? How can we help now that we know what the true cost of living is for our older adults here in LA and across the state? What can we do to help close that gap? And so that's what this report goes through.
Well, we need to talk about that. What can we do? I'm assuming these numbers are being provided to our legislators. They've got to know what's coming.
That's right. That's right. And so what we did is we actually released this information about a month ago at a state Senate hearing in Sacramento, and we had a press conference at the Capitol, and what we're doing is we're urging our lawmakers to adopt this standard in contrast to the federal poverty line.
Well, it's much more realistic. What a joke to think it's $10,000 is the poverty level in Southern California. We just saw the numbers up.
That's right.
$33,000 if you're
and why that's so important is that the federal poverty line is actually used to determine who gets access to our different public supports.
Yes.
And so if you're below that $10,200, you can get access to supports. If you're $10,201, often you are ineligible for many income supports in California and across the country. And so what we're trying to do with this report is to show that there's a big gap between that federal poverty line and what it really costs to live at a basic, modest budget, and to urge our policymakers to adopt this new standard as a way to measure who gets access to supports and how we can help more broadly our low-income seniors in California.
And we must do this. It's going to quadruple. The population is going to quadruple of our seniors in the foreseeable future. Stephen, what drove the need to assemble these figures? Were you just tired of people throwing out numbers that you knew were lowball numbers?
Actually, it's interesting. People have been talking for 15 or 20 years about how the federal poverty line is not an adequate measure of what it takes to live in the country. One of the most important flaws of the federal poverty line is it's the same number across the entire country.
Yes.
So whether you're living in Iowa or Montana or Los Angeles, it's exactly the same number. And that, just on the face of it, is ludicrous. Everybody knows it costs more to live in a large coastal city than it does in a rural area.
Sure.
So this actually came about through an initiative of Wider Opportunities for Women, which is a Washington, D.C. think tank. And they looked at the need to come up with a new way to look at poverty. And this actually started a year ago in Massachusetts, where they rolled out a Massachusetts version of this. California is the second state to roll this out and work with the legislature and policymakers. And what we're really trying to do is to have this as a grassroots movement. For 20 years, academics and people at the top have said this isn't working and nothing has been done. And so now what we're trying to do is to say, okay, what we really need to do is to start locally and show that adopting the older standard provides a better measure of income security and build up so that eventually it'll roll out among up to 20 states and hopefully will be adopted at the federal level as well.
I just love the notion that UCLA has undertaken this project, because our centers of higher learning are resources. They are precisely where you have to go in order to have a reasoned argument. Now, I know we all live with housing costs and we talk about what our homes are worth and escalating and then decreasing mortgages. And why is it such a big factor, though, in these numbers, Susan? There's a big disparity for those who have paid off their mortgage and those who haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you see is that housing prices can consume, even for renters, over half of a senior's overall budget.
Right, I got you.
And with someone that's paid off that mortgage, someone that bought that house 30 years ago and has paid off the mortgage, they're in that best economic situation because, as we know, over the past 30 years, housing prices have escalated so rapidly.
It's
and so
amazing.
In that situation, it's saying this is what it's reflecting. Over the years, here's how the housing costs have increased.
Well, and I know we see trouble in the news when people think of their house as a piggy bank, that somehow I can use this equity that I've built up, and before you know it, the market takes a turn south, and what you think you've planned for just doesn't work anymore.
And why you see so many people, the issue of the homeowners with a mortgage, so many more people have refinanced exactly that, so they can live off their home, but when that value decreases, then that cash becomes less and less.
Right. We have to take a little pause here. It's time for a short break. And when we come back, we will continue our discussion of the California Elder Economic Security Standard. We'll be right back.
A revolution has come to broadcast television, even bigger than the change to color. On February 17th, 2009, television goes all digital. But without an upgrade, some TVs will stop working. Find out what you need to do. Call this number or visit dtvanswers.com to see how you can get free over-the-air digital TV with better picture, better sound, and more channels. See what you're missing. Make sure your TV is DTV.
Hey, buddy! Don't you know you should never leave a cooking pan unattended? And a working smoke detector can warn you of a fire. Like the one behind me. My hero!
Next time, listen to the ball. Have a smoke detector and a fire extinguisher that work.
How'd you know?
The ball called.
Welcome back to Aging in LA. Our topic today is the California Elder Economic Security Standard, which is a measure of well-being that determines the income and supports needed for older adults to live modestly, depending on their health and life circumstances. Our guests, Susan Smith, the director of the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, and Dr. Stephen Wallace, who is with the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. Thanks again to both of you for coming. Now, we need to jump back down into the aggregate numbers as they develop and how it contrasts to the federal levels and why this is such an important target. So if we could have that screen up, please, for the federal standards. There we go. Now, the reason this is California-centric, county by county, is there are big disparities in those numbers. Stephen, would you walk us through them?
Sure. What's really important is we saw earlier that for a renter in the city of Los Angeles, it costs about $23,000 for a single person to have a basic standard of living. The federal government says that an older person should be able to survive on $10,210. Now, as we saw earlier, the cost of renting a one-bedroom apartment is over $1,000 a month.
Right.
So what the federal government claims an older person should be able to survive on in Los Angeles is not enough even to pay rent, let alone the food, to buy your prescription drugs, to take a bus downtown. Now, California has a program called Supplemental Security Income, which is known as SSI, which is that second line there. And as you can see, they say that if you receive SSI, you no longer live in poverty because they're providing an income that's $60 more per year than the federal poverty line. But what the Elder Standard says is you're still less, you're $10,000 in the hole, even when the state is helping you come up to what it thinks the federal government says you should have.
And these are modest living circumstances. We're not talking about a two-bedroom overlooking the sea.
No. So once again, and then the other numbers that were on the slide also showed you that what people get on average for Social Security in the city of Los Angeles is only about $12,000. So a lot of people, as they're approaching retirement age, think, oh, I'll be getting Social Security, that'll be plenty, I can live on it. But once again, that's way short of the $23,000 a person needs. And finally, it shows the disparity in total retirement income. So that's pensions and Social Security and other amounts of money that people make. And the median, so it's half the people above, half the people below in the city of Los Angeles. For women are $18,000, and for men are 24, almost 25. So really, it's only men, including pensions, including any supplemental income that they get from investments and so forth.
You know, the nature of numbers, they are not intended to be alarming. It's to give you a knowledge base from which you can plan your future. And Susan, you mentioned something during the break. It's not to feel guilty if you haven't made it to these levels because there is help available.
That's right. I think there's two important points there. One is that when you look at the numbers and you compare the Elder Standard to the federal poverty line, to average Social Security, which 1 out of 3 Californians rely on exclusively, and to average retirement income, you see that there is a big gap and there is a systemic problem. A lot of older adults, they think if only I worked harder, worked longer hours, saved more money, then I wouldn't be struggling today.
Right.
And what we see is that it's not their fault. And many who are eligible for supports are reluctant to get those supports because they feel ashamed.
Oh,
they feel
and
this
they
sense.
mustn't. They worked for it. They paid for it.
Exactly. They worked their whole lives, they paid into a system, and it's time that that system now gives back. And so what we're urging adults is not to feel ashamed to get support. There are resources out there. The City of LA, the Department of Aging, has a 1-800 number, an info line,
Yes.
where you can get support if you're one of those adults struggling out there today. And that number is 1-800-339-6993. So we think it's really important that people do get those supports that they are eligible for. They recognize it's not their fault, and we, as a society, see that there's something systemic going on.
That's right.
And with the aging baby boomers, this problem is only going to increase. And so what we're trying to do is we're showing a new measure of where the income adequacy, what the goal is for our public programs and for our individual savings. And so that with that, we can now plan. With the millions of baby boomers in California, it's projected to double the number of older adults by 2020.
Well,
so it's a way to plan for the future.
Wait, and it's closer to the reality. How many times do we see a government program proposed? They say $400 billion, and we all go, well, that's okay. And the next year, it's $1 billion too. It's like, just tell me the truth. We'll make some allowances. It's expensive to live in Southern California. Darn it, it is. And where does the train go off the tracks most often? Is it from healthcare costs, or say an accident or injury? Is that what's affecting our seniors?
I mean, often what you see is that when the elders might be doing okay, and then a spouse dies. And then especially for women who are living longer than men,
Yes.
then their entire economic picture is sort of in shambles because they were relying on that two income. Or they have a medical debt. And suddenly it sort of throws them off track. And so, I mean, we titled this Elders Living on the Edge because there's that point where I might be doing okay, and then I have a minor change in my situation, and then all the planning and all the savings I did is thrown off.
Yeah, exactly. Dr. Wallace, can you explain how these housing costs keep driving these numbers?
Sure. As we see on the slide that's on the screen, it's really the high cost of housing on a day-to-day basis is what's threatening the economic security of seniors in California. When you look at how much it costs for a renter to have that one-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles City as a fraction of their total living expenses, it's over half, 53%.
Over half. Amazing
Goes
to have
just
a roof.
just to have a roof over your head, and a modest roof, not a Beverly Hills roof, just a modest roof.
I understand.
If you're still paying on your mortgage, it's over 2/3 of all the income that you have under the Elder Standard would go for your housing costs. And for those without a mortgage, it's just about 1/3. Now, the federal government says that you should pay about 30% of your income for housing. So really the only people who make an amount equal to the Elder Standard in the city of Los Angeles who fit the federal guidelines are people who've paid off their homes.
Wow.
And there's sort of a good news, bad news scenario here. On the one hand, there are housing supports. There's federal housing programs like Section 8.
Right.
There are some state supportive housing programs. And so there is support to help really cover that cost and to make that biggest difference in a senior's budget. However, there are long waiting lists,
Right.
and there's a shortage.
Well, I know we had to fight like the Dickens when we came back from the White House Conference on Aging through the California Commission on Aging to get a set-aside for seniors for their housing costs. It was,
And that is the kind of recommendations that we're making. We're saying, state, if you're going to develop low-income housing using tax credits, you should at least have a set-aside that's equal to the proportion of seniors in that local community.
and how about making a provision for its expected growth?
Exactly. And we're not saying more, we're not saying less. We're saying seniors should get their fair share. And the other thing that's important is that on the ballot initiative in June 3rd, there's an initiative around rent control. And that proposition, Prop 98, would essentially destroy rent control in California. And so we're saying we need to protect rent control, especially for our seniors, if they're going to be able to stay. And so we're saying that, vote and vote no on that particular initiative.
Because this is so important to people and it's so personal, what's the best way to use these numbers? How do you fit this into your planning for retirement or perhaps re-entry into the job market? Dr. Wallace, how can they get these numbers and use them?
Well, the numbers are available on at least 2 websites. The UCLA Center for Health Policy Research has all of the data broken out by all of the different components that we talked about earlier.
Yes.
And that's available at www.healthpolicy.ucla.edu. And what's really useful, I actually had a friend who used this before we published it, and he was thinking of retiring early. And so I sent him the components, and he looked at each of the components and assessed it against his own lifestyle and own standard of living, and it actually gave him a little bit of pause to say, well, gee, if I'm thinking of retiring early, I'm going to have enough income to survive another 30 years, and is that enough? So it's very helpful for retirement planning purposes.
I understand.
And if I need to supplement my income, this is by how much?
Okay.
Exactly.
I'm sorry our time is up for today's edition of Aging in LA. Thanks so much to our guests. From the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, its director, Susan Smith, and Dr. Stephen Wallace, who is with the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. And now, it's time for a new feature on Aging in LA, Senior Stat Shots, where we look at statistics or information that pertains to senior citizens. Heart disease and cancer continue to be the two leading causes of death for senior citizens, as they have for the past 2 decades. Here's a quick look at chronic disease among seniors in the United States. As you can see, 52% of seniors have hypertension. 50% have had a doctor-diagnosed arthritis. 46% have chronic joint symptoms. 32% of those 65 or older suffer from all types of heart disease. 21% have coronary heart disease. And 21% have or have had cancer. And 17% suffer from diabetes. And that's today's Senior Stat Shots. The Los Angeles Department of Aging produces this program with CityView, Channel 35, so that seniors living in Los Angeles and surrounding communities are well informed on the many issues that face them in everyday life. And also to let you know of the many services that the Department of Aging offers our senior citizens. Now, we'd like to hear from you with comments on the program, what you like, what you think can be improved, and ideas for future programs. So give us a call. The number's right there on your screen, area code 213-252-4088. That's 213-252-4088. Call us with your comments and ideas, and we look forward to hearing from you. I'm Paul Peterson for the Los Angeles Department of Aging, the people here at CityView, Channel 35, and all of our guests on Aging in LA. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.